Hello beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation, the show that takes a look at what took a wrong turn on the yellow brick road between books and films. I'm going to confess something to you now, beautiful watchers. As children we all had that one thing that scared the living shit out of us, but for some reason didn't seem to bother anyone else. Anyone who denies this is a damn liar. For me personally, that one thing was the Wicked Witch of the West. I know she was meant to be a little bit scary, but my reaction on first seeing her was unequivocal terror, the likes of which I'd never experienced before. If my mum and dad are watching this, they've just learnt the reason I kept a bucket of water by my bed for almost a decade. I only mention this to you now so you can fully appreciate my dedication in revisiting this film so I can do this episode.
I heard of once in a lullaby.
The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was first published in 1900. This book's over 100 years old. I don't know why, because there's far older books out there, but that kind of messes with my head. The film itself celebrated its 75th anniversary last year, and it still manages to be one of those movies that provokes a double take if someone confesses to not having seen it. Authored by L. Frank Baum, Barham? Fuck's sake. Looks like Enda and Crichton have a new friend on the list of names I can never seem to get right. Authored by this guy, the book's popularity spawned 13 direct sequels and dozens of licensed spin-offs by other authors. So, where's the army of movie sequels, you may be wondering? Well, bear in mind that Hollywood's infuriating habit of milking every successful hit movie with a bunch of inferior sequels wasn't as prominent back in the 1940s. And to be honest, most of the follow-up books' plots might have been a little bit too dark for the film's fanbase, as proven by Disney's 1985 box office flop, Return to Oz. Yes, that will get its own episode someday. So obviously there weren't any musical numbers in the book, so I'm mostly going to be ignoring those parts of the film. I'm also not going to be delving into the aspects of the film that made people believe it was a big metaphor for homosexuality. Not because I don't think it is, just because it's not really relevant to this review. In both versions, Dorothy lives on a bleak-ass farm with her aunt and uncle. A cyclone hits that carries her house away with her inside it to a far-off land that can most fittingly be described as a bad LSD trip. The house happens to land on a witch, killing her and freeing the unusually short and weird people previously enthralled to her. Even though Dorothy inherits her sick footwear, she immediately declares that she wants to return home to Kansas. It's suggested to her that she appeal to a mighty wizard known as Oz for help, and she's directed to a road made of yellow brick which will lead her to him. Along the way, she meets and joins forces with a sentient scarecrow with cognitive issues, a man made of tin who regrets his inability to feel emotions, and a lion lacking the excessive bravery he feels is meant to be inherent in his people, all of whom laboured under the misconception that the esteemed wizard might be able to magically compensate for these perceived shortcomings. After making their way to the city in which the wizard resides and winning an audience with him, they are given the task of murdering the last remaining wicked witch in the land. Against all expectations, they actually achieve this, as it turns out the witch is quite the acrophobe. They return to the wizard to collect their agreed upon rewards, but alas, it turns out he's a complete dickhead and a con man from the real world with no magical abilities whatsoever. How he goes about place-sating her companions differs wildly from book to film, so we'll go back to that later, but he does offer to fly Dorothy back to the real world in a hot air balloon. Unfortunately, Dorothy manages to fuck this up by missing the takeoff and has to find an alternative means of transportation. As luck, or perhaps irony would have it, it turns out she was wearing her means of getting home all along, and her shoes can teleport her right back to the godforsaken existence she etches out in the southern United States. Despite these similarities, I would have to say that this is another case of them keeping the bare bones of the plot, but changing enough of the details that the overarching message and the original tone get completely lost. Speaking of changes, the book makes little to no effort to establish Dorothy's life in Kansas. There was nothing about her falling into pigsties, her dog being confiscated or running away. It was just 1.5 pages of describing her grey-ass farm and her grey-ass aunt and uncle, and then BAM! Cyclone! The devil, you say? More character development in the film? You had my curiosity, now you have my attention. You may find this hard to believe due to how iconic they became, but the footwear that Dorothy gets from the dead witch are in no way anything like ruby slippers. They are in fact silver shoes. Walking shoes, judging from their description, and they don't just magically attach themselves to her feet. Dorothy willingly puts them on because they look like they might be good for a long journey. I don't get it. Ruby slippers, silver shoes, what narrative advantage is served by changing the nature of her feet garments? Other than making her slightly more fabulous, I suppose? The Scarecrow isn't massively different in the book, or to be more precise, he's the least changed when compared to the other two. The most interesting difference is that his face is just a crude paint job on a sack. Well, that's not terrifying at all, and it's revealed that it was only created 2 days before, and he described what it was like becoming alive. He starts hearing as his ears were painted on, and he starts seeing as his eyes were added. A rather unsettling concept, in my opinion. The Tin Man, or the Tin Woodsman as he's referred to in the book, has a backstory that's all kinds of fucked up. He was actually a normal flesh and blood human woodsman at one point who had the misfortune to fall in love and get engaged to a hot little munchkin woman whose mother didn't approve. So she bribed the Wicked Witch of the East to curse his axe. Every time the woodsman tried to cut down a tree, the axe would slip or bounce off and cut off one of the poor fucker's limbs. Instead of simply switching to a non-axe related profession, he chose instead to get the local tin worker to make him a replacement prosthetic every time this happened. This eventually included his arms, legs, and even his head. Finally, he accidentally stabbed himself in the heart with his axe and completed his transformation into the Tin Woodsman. Now at first, he was actually quite pleased with his new body as it never grew hungry or tired, but a side effect of not having a heart anymore was that he no longer felt human emotions, and didn't give a flying fuck about his bride-to-be and just dedicated himself to his wood-chopping profession. During the year that he spent rusted in one place, he realised that he really wanted to get back together with her, hence his desire for a heart. He didn't quite click onto the fact that if he wanted to love her again, it meant his emotions had come back of their own accord. Oh boy, was the Cowardly Lion changed a lot. I should probably start by mentioning that no one was anthropomorphic in the book. With the other two guys, this wasn't a big deal as they were already reasonably human-shaped, but in the case of the lion, it meant that he was an actual motherfucking lion, and a big one at that. And the differences don't end there. Despite referring to himself as a coward, and remarking quite often about how scared he is all the time, the lion was a fucking badass. He could scare the shit out of everyone in the entire world simply by roaring. He also doesn't even hesitate for a second to throw himself between Dorothy and two Kalidars, creatures with the body of a bear, the head of a tiger, and giant-ass motherfucking claws, and calmly states that he intends to fight to the death to protect her. At one point in the book, the Wicked Witch of the West captures him and keeps him in a cage for days trying to break him and make him her slave, but he doesn't even flinch. He just tells her if she comes any closer, he'll bite her fucking head off. Did anyone else kind of secretly think that the wizard in the film was kind of full of shit when he told the lion he had courage inside him all along? The dude was a pussy, no pun intended. He was a pussy all the way through the film, and it was pretty clear to me he was going to go right on being a pussy afterwards. He was just going to be a pussy with an ironic medal pinned to him. With the book line, it would have made so much more sense. He was nothing but heroic. He was just ashamed that deep down he was terrified while he was doing it. Oddly enough, Glinda was actually the good witch of the south, and she only pops up in the final chapter. The witch of the north who greets Dorothy in Munchkinland was nice enough, but she was an old woman without much actual power. To help Dorothy, she kisses her on the forehead, leaving a round silver mark. It didn't actually do much except convey a "you fuck with her, you fuck with me" kind of message to the people who saw her. If you ever found yourself wondering if the Broadway musical Wicked, which portrayed the Wicked Witch of the West as not being all that bad after all, was more accurate to the book than the film, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed. The witch was pretty damn wicked. She enslaved a whole race of people called the Quadlings. But she wasn't actually in the story enough to be considered to be the main villain. She actually just spends most of the book minding her own business in her kingdom until Dorothy and the gang are sent to kill her. After seeing the world's most effeminate assassination party approaching, she sends several hordes of beasts at them to try to stop them. The first is a pack of fearsome wolves, but the Tin Man goes medieval on their asses and chops those fuckers to pieces. Then she tries sending a flock of crows to peck out their eyes, but the Scarecrow just uses this as an outlet for all his pent-up rage towards birdkind, and he twists their heads off one by one. After several other failed attempts, she tries sending her Quadling slaves at them, but the Cowardly Lion once again proves his awesomeness by turning them back with a single roar. They were, however, eventually overpowered by the flying monkeys. Incidentally, it amused me to hear Nick Fury use them as a metaphor for mindless henchmen in the Avengers, because in the book, the witch didn't actually have very much control over them whatsoever. They were an independent people who just happened to be cursed to be summonable 3 times by the owner of a magic hat which she had pinched. Using them to capture Dorothy was the third and last time the witch could use it, so when they dropped her off, they were all, "Well, see ya, bitch. Take care and go fuck yourself." After Dorothy kills the witch, she takes the hat and the monkeys work for her instead. She spends the rest of the book using them as an airline service whenever she wanted to go anywhere. It's also amusing to note that Dorothy didn't splash the witch by accident. She dumped a bucket of water on her head for taking one of her shoes. The witch learned too late the lesson that every boyfriend learns at one point or another. Do not get between a woman and her shoes. So it turns out the Emerald City wasn't actually emerald. For years, the wizard had insisted that everyone wear green-tinted sunglasses locked onto their faces to protect them from the lights reflecting off every surface. Since no one had ever taken them off, they never found out that the city wasn't any greener than any other once you got inside it. Over the years, many people have wondered about Dorothy's determination to return home to her depressing dirt farm existence when the Land of Oz is clearly a more interesting and magical place, and indeed, in the book it's an even more perplexing question. In the film, you could make the argument that she's been hounded by the witch since she got there, and almost everyone's been kind of a dick to her everywhere she went. However, most people in the book went out of their way to be nice to her, and at the end she's pretty much been given the option to live as a princess in the Emerald City, being waited on by servants and having the love and trust of the city's ruler and the admiration of the people. And yet she still whines constantly that she wants to immediately go back to live on the poor-ass dirt farm with a pair of people so depressing they are alarmed by the sound of laughter. At one point, she tries to explain her reasoning to the Scarecrow, putting it down to the weird, intense patriotism I do sometimes witness in my American brothers. But even then it sounds a little weird. The Scarecrow has no fucking idea what she's talking about, but assumes he must be missing something due to his lack of brains. Just like in the film, the wizard attempts to placate Dorothy's friends by telling them they already have all the thinking power, emotions, and courage that they would ever need. They just didn't realise it. However, unlike the film, and I almost pissed myself laughing at this point, they were having none of it, responding with, "Bitch, you better get us some actual fucking brains, hearts, and courage, or we're gonna beat the shit out of you." So the terrified wizard ends up giving them placebos instead of metaphors, stuffing the Scarecrow's head full of putty, cutting a hole in the Tin Man's chest and sticking a silk heart inside, and giving the lion a green drink he told him was a courage potion. FYI, he secures the Scarecrow's brain with a bunch of needles that stick out of his head whenever he thinks too hard, officially making this once lovable dolt a cross between Jonathan Crane and Pinhead. Probably the single most interesting difference between the book and the film was the ending. They make it a damn near certainty in the film that the events in Oz were nothing more than a fevered dream. However, the book takes it in the exact opposite direction. When Dorothy appears back in Kansas, her aunt asks her where she's disappeared to all this time, and her uncle has built a new house to replace the one that flew away in the cyclone. In keeping with this certainty of the Land of Oz actually existing, there are no real-world counterparts to her companions.
Segues are hard sometimes.
The film wraps up when Oz fucks off, but in the book they actually keep on going for a few more chapters. Because Glinda hasn't featured until this point, she has no idea what's been going on, and the group has to travel south to ask her for help. As soon as Dorothy gets there, Glinda tells her it was a shame that she hadn't been able to help her sooner, and shows her how to use her shoes to magically get home right away. This highlights a key difference between the two versions of Glinda.
Oh, will you help me? Can you help me? You don't need to be helped any longer. You've always had the power to go back to Kansas. I have.
Then why didn't you tell her before?
On Monday she's a bitch, on Tuesday she's a bitch, and Wednesday to Saturday she's a bitch. Then on Sunday just to be different, she's a super king, Kamehameha, bitch.
On an unrelated note, Glinda has an organised military of sexy women at her disposal.
I'm scare-roused.
The journey to find her takes the storyline of the book down a serious detour into the realms of the fucked up and disturbing. One of the things they come across is a whole city made of china, including the people, some of whom have clearly been broken and glued back together. There's even a clown. This clearly wasn't intended to be the scary part of the book, but, you know, fuck! Right after that, they come across a forest full of animals, and the formerly cowardly lion is asked to kill a giant-ass spider that's been catching and eating them.
Follow the yellow brick road. Follow the yellow brick road. Follow, 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 follow.
Whoa, what the fucking hell's that thing? Fuck the yellow brick road, let's get the fuck out of here!
By the time Dorothy is ready to leave Oz, all three of her friends are now rulers of their own respective kingdoms. The Scarecrow was designated as the wizard's heir in the Emerald City, the Tin Woodsman was asked by the Quadlings to replace the witch in her lands to the west, I guess he forgot about his betrothed again, and the lion is made king of all the southern forest for killing the giant spider monster. Apparently, the author felt that a dictator for life position was the only good enough happy ending for his characters.
The Dom's final thoughts. Bloody hell, first a never-ending story, now this? Are there no famously whimsical films out there that don't have some surprisingly dark elements hidden away in the books? I think, beautiful watchers, that I'd recommend putting a certain amount of distance in your head between these two works. Appreciate The Wizard of Oz for being the technicolor breakthrough and the harmless musical comedy that it is, and appreciate The Wonderful Wizard of Oz for being a remarkably easy read about a fantastical land that somehow manages to be way more innocent and naive, yet way darker than our own. Would you excuse me, beautiful watchers? I have to go and see the wizard, and ask him for some fresh trousers. You know what? I'm actually going to let that sort itself out. Hello, beautiful watchers. I now have a Patreon page, which is quite fortuitous, really, considering there's going to be some pretty serious medical bills in my immediate future. Anyways, if you fancy supporting the show, there'll be some rewards you can earn, like being in the control group of friends I contact before every Lost in Adaptation episode to get a feel for how many people read the books, seen the film, stuff like that. There is, of course, absolutely no pressure, but if you do decide to contribute, thank you very much, and I will see you next time.